Alright, after several system crashes, we're gonna try this again, shall we? This will be take 5, and we'll see if we can't get this to function, now that I've done a touch of Googling. Alright, so we're gonna start off talking about the skeletal system, and the first thing we need to talk about, of course, is the prefix we'll be using throughout. OS, or osteo. Os or osteo before any suffix means we're referencing bones. Osteoporosis. So, all about bones. The skeleton is a framework of support for the body and the framework of support for your muscles. It allows movement and support for all your organs, muscles. There are 206 bones in the human body. And when we look at the skeletal system overall, we are talking about both the bones and the cartilage. So, when we say skeletal system, we mean both bone and cartilage, because we find cartilage between the vertebral disc, or between the vertebra, the intervertebral discs. We find cartilage in every joint, that hyaline cartilage, and of course we find that little symphysis holding your pelvis together. So here are the two main divisions of the skeletal system. So you can see there in two separate colors, pink and blue there. The axial skeleton is essentially your skull, spinal cord, and ribs. Just those three things: skull, spinal cord, ribs. That's the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is, well, your limbs. So, all the bones of your arms and legs, your shoulder blades, and your pelvis. So, axial skeleton, skull, vertebra, ribs, sternum. Appendicular skeleton, your arms and legs, and your scapula, clavicle, and pelvis. Clavicle being your collarbone right here. That's part of the assembly that connects up to your arms. So it's appendicular. Okay, so let's get a more detailed look at bone and learn a few new terms, because we did a little bit of bone stuff in the previous, in the lecture about the body systems, the 4 body tissue types, but now we'll get a little more detail here. So, first off, osteocytes exist in pits within the matrix. So the bone matrix is made up of 2 components: calcium and phosphorus crystals, hydroxyapatite crystals, and collagen. So the calcium and phosphorus crystals, the hydroxyapatite, provides that rigid structure, but it is also brittle. And then it's the collagen that provides some small flexibility and strength to the system so that it can resist impacts. Bone has a rich blood supply, which is important because you need to provide nutrients to the bone. The fact that it has a rich blood supply means that your bone can undergo growth, it can be repaired, and it can remodel or change the shape, not really the shape, but change the thickness of a bone, whether it's increasing or decreasing the thickness of the bone. So, bones can grow, bones can be repaired, and they can be remodeled. And it's that rich blood supply which is really what allows this. Remembering that cartilage has no blood supply, it's why damage to cartilage sort of just sticks around. Your cartilage doesn't get repaired because it has no blood supply. All right. The bone marrow is at the center of long bones, so it is really important. It is where we make blood cells. So the marrow is in the central cavity of long bones. Long bones being bones that appear long, amazingly enough. So we're talking about your humerus right here, radius and ulna, radius to a smaller amount, but your ulna, your femur, right? Those are long bones. And those have that center cavity that's lined with spongy bone, because spongy bone creates those big wide spaces. That center cavity has the marrow in it. All right, so here's just a little picture, right? So I like to indicate that this is compact bone here. This cross section is of compact bone. We have a little bit of spongy bone here, showing you where the long bone faces the marrow cavity. You can look at the little cross section image they have right there, where it's from. And we remember that compact bone is made up of densely packed little tree ring structures. So if we look at one of these little tree ring structures, we see blood vessels running up the center. You also see nerves, and here we can also see the little pits where we find our osteocytes. So this is a really nice electron micrograph, colored for contrast, showing us the pits where the osteocytes are found. We're seeing this ring-like growth pattern, just like a tree, where as the bone increases in width, in thickness, a new ring is laid down. And we see that center cavity where we have blood vessels running. So this is sort of one unit, one osteon. So compact bone is very dense and strong, and it's made up of dense packings of these tree ring units. And each of these tree ring units, as I said, is an osteon. So it's got, each osteon has a hollow center where blood and nerves travel, and then we have rings of osteocytes around the center. So, new vocab to learn. Hopefully not terrible. If we go back to the previous picture, we can see that we have multiple osteons in compact bone. So, compact bone is given strength by the dense packing of these osteons together. We do not see osteons in spongy bone. So, there we go. Here's a cross-section with that central canal where we see the blood vessels, and we can see these rings. And the rings have pits with osteocytes within them. You do not have to remember the word lacuna. But anytime you see in a picture lacuna, that's a pit where the osteocytes are found. Lamellae, if you look at these pictures here or look up your own, those are the individual rings laid down as bone increases in thickness. So, not terrible. And here's a nice little cross-section of compact bone under the actual microscope. Just a light microscope, thin slice there, and we can really see just how many osteons are cramped up together to make that thick, dense, compact bone. Let's go into a little bit more detail with spongy bone. So, as I said, spongy bone is that irregularly shaped spurs and rods with lots of hollow spaces between. I talked about how it lines the center of long bones, and that's where you find the marrow, but you also find it anywhere where you have a lot of impact occurring. So right here you can see in my picture, this is a femur, right? This part right here is where it connects up to your pelvis, right? So my femur connects into my pelvis, and this little circular head It's what joints up there. And whenever I take a step, I put a lot of gravity into that. My skeletal system moves and impacts. And so there's spongy bone there to provide shock absorption. So anywhere you need shock absorption, you'll find spongy bone, as well as you'll find spongy bone around the marrow cavity. So again, review, it's irregular growth, rods and spurs, spiny and branching, and it has a very low density because of all those holes in there. So it absorbs impacts quite well, and it also creates a lot of space for that marrow cavity. So speaking of the femur, let's take a look at the basic parts of a femur. Really any long bone, but a femur is really recognizable. So this basic anatomy here will count for your femur. We'll also see those same structures in your humerus, in your ulna and radius. Let's see. Ulna and radius. Have those switched. And you'll also see it in your shins. So anywhere we have long bones. Oh, that's why they're called long bones. Crazy. Okay, so the long part of it is called the shaft. Right? At either end of the shaft, we have the heads. So these are rounded ends that are jointed. They form connections up to other bones. So that's the basic of anatomy of a long bone. We have a shaft running down the center, and then we have a head at either end. So here on our femur, this is the head that will interact with the pelvis. Then down here, we have a big old head that will interact with the bones of the lower leg. All right. So again, break it down. The shaft is lined with compact bone, and this allows it to resist vertical forces quite well. So the outer part of the shaft is lined with compact bone. We have compact bone because long bones are hollow. You know, I'm making this, structure here. So lining the hollow space there, or making up the outer ring there, is compact bone. And that allows it to resist a lot of vertical forces because your long bones often take impacts. As I said, long bones are hollow because they have that marrow cavity. The marrow cavity is lined by a little bit of spongy bone. Marrow can actually be separated into two basic types, red marrow and yellow marrow. So red marrow is bone marrow that actively produces red blood cells. So in children through puberty, your bone marrow is mostly red marrow. But as you get into adulthood and your growth slows and stops, a lot of your bone marrow is converted into yellow marrow. Yellow marrow is literally fat storage, right? So when you're growing in size, all your bones are growing, you're increasing your full-on brain, everything. You're just growing. You need a constant supply of new blood to fill in the amount of new blood vessels you're making and to provide the amount of oxygen to support and provide the nutrients to support, So you got red marrow during the growth stages of a human. Also in the hollow cavity, we find what are called osteoclasts. An osteoclast breaks down bone. So this is a cell, osteobone, and a clast is a type of cell. So an osteoclast breaks down bone. So it can, from within, increase the size of the marrow cavity and that also decreases the thickness of the bone. So this will happen under different conditions within that bone. So I actually talked a bunch about bone marrow, but we'll just repeat it for good measure. So yellow is fat and red is producing blood cells. Red bone marrow is rich with stem cells. So these hematopoietic stem cells, you do not need to know the word hematopoietic. I happen to know that. The stem cells in marrow produce red blood cells. They produce white blood cells. And look here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different kinds of white blood cells. Probably didn't realize that. And then we also get platelets out of this. So those stem cells in the bone marrow are responsible for producing all the formed elements in the blood. If you recall back to the lecture on the 4 basic tissue types, blood is a connective tissue, has formed elements, and those formed elements are red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. So, boom. All right. We've talked about the shaft and the marrow inside the marrow cavity. Now let's talk about the heads, or the rounded ends of long bones. So femur is great because it has a very large head at one end. Nice view of the anatomy. So we have a solid head structure. So it's compact bone around the outside, providing strength, but we have a thick, dense, spongy center. Well, thick and dense is the bad word there to use. It's filled in completely with spongy bone. So we can see right here, contrasting with the shaft where we have a hollow marrow cavity, up at on either end with the heads, we have completely filled in with spongy bone. I don't want to use the word solid spongy bone because spongy bone is, much less dense, but there it is. We don't have a marrow cavity in the heads. That's probably the best way to contrast that. So it's filled in completely with spongy bone, and that allows it to resist impacts. So impact forces, when bones, collide with each other because of gravity, because you're walking, all that spongy bone helps absorb the impact, prevent damage. The heads of long bones articulate. So when two things articulate, they are connected and moving. So the heads of long bones are forming joints with other bones. So all my long bone examples joint up with other bones. Right here on this femur, this is the articular surface, the head right here that will join up with the pelvis. So the articular or joint surface is lined with hyaline cartilage. If you'll recall, hyaline cartilage is made up almost entirely of collagen, creating this incredibly smooth layer. And that extremely smooth hyaline cartilage is there to absorb shock and reduce friction when those bones are moving in the joint. Because if you didn't have that protective cartilage there, the bone would grind against each other. And because of that rough surface, because bones are, a matrix of hydroxyapatite crystals and collagen, it will grind against each other. In fact, in a joint where you've had damaged cartilage or you've lost cartilage, you begin to lose bone because the bones literally grind. Okay. Now it's time to talk about the actual outside of a bone. So if you look at a bone that you get from like a butcher or, you know, just a bone lying out in the desert or something, white bleached bone, you do not see one of the most important parts of a bone, and that's the periosteum. Peri, around, osteum, bone, so it's surrounding the bone. The periosteum is actually a membranous layer, a membrane surrounding the outside of the bone. This is really important. Blood meets up with the bone through the periosteum. We find a rich blood supply in the periosteum. It's literally connected to the bone. Provides a little bit of reduced friction when you're moving your muscles around. And it's a rich source of osteoblasts. So, remember I said osteoclasts destroy bone. Well, osteoblasts build bone. So, in the center, we have osteoclasts that can increase the hollow space, decrease the thickness. And on the outside, in the periosteum, we have osteoblasts that can lay down new bone and increase the thickness. So, in bones that get used a lot, bones that experience a lot of impact, you tend to see an increased thickness. And then when bones do not experience much impact, there's a decreased thickness. So a runner might have thicker femur, a thicker femur than someone else because they are regularly putting impact into that femur, so you build up more compact bone to give it more strength. So the more impact a bone receives, the thicker it tends to get, the more work you do to a bone. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about bone remodeling, right? Because I said that the rich blood supply allows growth, repair, and remodeling. And since we've already talked about osteoclasts and osteoblasts, it'll be simple to just put this into remodeling. So, we have osteoclasts in the marrow cavity. There are actually also osteoclasts under the periosteum. So, they're inside the marrow cavity, and they're on the outside surface of the bone. Osteoblasts are primarily in the periosteum. Bones are constantly being remodeled. Constantly. This can be based on activities, like I just said. It can also be to release calcium into the blood. You need calcium circulating in your blood, in part because muscle contraction is heavily dependent on calcium. And so, if your calcium levels in your blood drop too much, you can actually break down some of the bone and release the calcium in the matrix into the blood. So, osteoclasts are important for releasing extra calcium. And then you have the interaction of osteoblasts and osteoclasts constantly adjusting the thickness of a bone. So, the more a bone is used, the more impact a bone experiences, the more those osteoblasts will build it up. All right. This is a model of the human skeleton with a number of bones pointed out. You'll notice I am not making you memorize 206 bones. There are 206 bones in the human body, and if you were to take a human anatomy and physiology class, you would be responsible for literally remembering all 206 bones. Made a little easier because the appendicular skeleton is basically just, doubles of the same bone. You have, the ulna and radius here, and the ulna and radius here. So, Yes, this is going to be on the test. Which is going to be specifically easier because, well, I got the key in the next slide. So here's my skull, scapula, humerus. I think the easiest way to remember this is to just touch the bone, right? So we've got your skull, your shoulder blade, your scapula. So scapula is your shoulder blade. Then we've got your humerus, arm bone there. This next line is pointing to the ribs. Actually, 3 different kinds of ribs, but I'm just making you know ribs. Then here we have the radius. So, radius, if you're trying to remember, it's the bone closest, when you feel the 2 bones in your forearm, it's the one on the thumb side. That's the radius. So, the radius will rotate around the ulna when you move your arm like this. So, not at the shoulder. This is rotating at the shoulder. But if you rotate while holding your elbow still, that's your radius rotating around the ulna, which is this bone on the pinky side. Ulna is cool because your elbow is literally the back end of the ulna coming out. And it interacts with a little notch in the humerus down here. So if you feel your humerus, you can actually feel there's a little circular flare of bone here. On the other side, you can find it there. And that's the far head of the humerus. And then this is the ulna interacting with that notch, creating that joint. So your elbow is the back end of your ulna. Okay. Let's see. Where was I? Ulna is actually on this side, and I'm sort of coming down and around, so got ahead of myself. Here we have what are called the metacarpals. So these are going to be the bones in your palm, and the metacarpals. So we have carpals, metacarpals, phalanges, right? Carpals is going to be right here. I'm just going to talk about the hand as a unit. So right in here, we have our wrist bones. There are actually something like 7 or 9 of them, 2 layers sort of interacting with each other, allowing your wrist to have that level of movement. They're funky-looking little boxy bones, which are neat, sort of irregularly shaped. Anyway, those are the carpals, allowing me to do this. Just a little set of bones right in here. Then we have the metacarpals. Think the palm of your hand. If you feel, you can feel there is one long bone for each finger in the meat of your palm. So that is the metacarpal. So you can feel that metacarpal for each one running the length of your palm. So then we have the phalanges. You have a total of, in each hand, 14 phalanges. 1, 2, 3. Easy to see because just look at, the little creases in your fingers. 1, 2, 3. So 3 here, 3 here, here. And then if you look at the creases in your thumb, we've got 1 bone here, 2. So thumb's a little different. So yeah. Carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Next up is your femur, the big old thigh bone. After that, we have the tibia and fibula. These are the two bones that make up your lower leg. So if you think of your shins, you're thinking of the tibia. So right here, the shin. So that's your tibia, large bone. There's actually a very small bone called the fibula that runs alongside it. So it's on the outside edge there, the fibula. Very small. It actually doesn't move on its own. It's solidly connected with some connective tissue right there. Some ligaments join the fibula and tibia together. So, pretty cool. Those are long bones. Then we have the feet. So, let's bust out my foot. All right, so again, when we think of our hand, we have movement, right? This foot can move around. So we're going to actually have very similar structures. So in my hand, the wrist bones are called carpals. In my foot, the equivalent are called tarsals, with a T, tarsals. So these make up what you think of when you think of your ankle. In fact, right here, this is the very far end of the fibula, and then on the inside is the very far end of the tibia. So the actual smooth, hard portion of your ankle there is just the bottom ends of the tibia and fibula. Wrong side though. Tibia and fibula. Pretty cool. And then what allows all that movement in your foot are the tarsals. So your heel is a tarsal. So then we get to this part of your foot here. Just like with your palm, in this part is one long bone, runs from about here to here, and that's the metatarsal. You have one for each toe, metatarsals. And then finally you have phalanges, so your little bitty toesies. The bones in your toes are the phalanges. And you have the same number of phalanges in your feet as in your hands. So if you were to very carefully look, you can find 3 phalanges for each toe except your big toe, which has 2. So, not too terrible. All right, we come up the other side here. So, this big long bone in the lower leg is the tibia. The little long bone on the outside of your lower leg is the fibula. Then we have our patella. Patella. The patella is your kneecap. So, it is the cap that covers over the articular, the joint between the tibia and the femur. So we have this articulation here where our femur connects up with our tibia. The fibula is actually not part of that joint. Connects up to the tibia before there. So joins in like right down here. So tibia, femur. That articulation is where we find the patella, covering it up. So, just helps your legs move. Patella is connected by a number of ligaments and tendons to either, so tendons connect to the muscles that control your thigh, and your tibia right there. And there are ligaments to provide the stability this joint needs, right? This whole setup here is to prevent overextension of this joint. In other words, this is as far as this joint bends, in part due to that patella and all the ligaments and tendons and everything there. I would not want to hyperextend this joint. So there we go. Got your patella. So coming back up, let's see, did I skip mentioning the pelvis? The easiest thing to feel with your pelvis are the little crests, the pelvic crests. So if you just stick your thumb in here, you can find, or your fingers, you can find your pelvic crest, right? So, nice little muscle attachment spot. I like to touch all of these bones to know them. So let's see. We've got skull, scapula, humerus, ribs. We got radius, metacarpals, phalanges. We've got femur. We've got tibia. We got metatarsals, phalanges. Here's our tarsals. Here's our fibula, patella, carpals. This is the ulna, radius, thumb side, ulna, pinky side. Ulna has the elbow. And then this next one is for the spinal column. So, your backbone. Coming back up, this last thing points to your collarbone, right here. Your collarbone is pretty neat. It interfaces up with your sternum. Oh, whoops. So this is the sternum here. It's where all your ribs connect up to. It's a flat bone. Just makes the very front of the rib cage. It's the sternum. It has this cool little notch at the top. And then on either side of the notch is where we join up to the clavicle, the collarbone. So the clavicle only has two basic points of articulation. It joins up with the sternum, and then it joins up with the scapula. The scapula is kind of cool because it joins up with your humerus and your collarbone, and that's it. It actually doesn't connect to your back, and there's no like joint connection to your back. It allows the scapula to have an impressive range of movement, which allows your arms to have that impressive range of movement. And then, of course, there's the joint where the humerus meets up with your scapula, which is a ball joint, which contributes to the impressive range of movement you can get out of your arm alone. So, boom. There's the key. Next up, let's talk a little bit about the different types of bone breaks we can see and how bones heal. So, we have 6 types of bone fractures we can actually talk about. So, a green stick fracture is an incomplete fracture. So, the break occurs and it doesn't break the bone completely through. So, breaks it a little bit. A fissure is a crack down the bone. So, we have our bone and we get a crack. A comminuted fracture is complete. So it's a complete fracture, which means the bone is completely separated. And it's comminuted because it causes these fragments. So it's a really bad fracture. This is going to require plates and screws to fix rather than just a cast. So a comminuted fracture is completely through the bone, and we get these fragments left. Transverse fracture is sort of like the end point of a green stick, right? It's a complete fracture through the bone, but you're not getting all those bone fragments. Oblique fractures occur at an angle other than right angles to the bone. So here's transverse fracture, oblique fracture, sort of a diagonal fracture. And then lastly is a spiral fracture. Spiral fractures caused when you twist a bone excessively. So very hard to produce a spiral fracture, you know, without external forces acting to twist your bones. So that's actually a pretty rough fracture when your bone twists and you get that fracture. So I'll be using keywords if you're going to have to name a fracture, or you may have to list off a couple of fracture types. So if I say a complete fracture that causes fragments, you know it's comminuted. If I say, you know, what's a crack down the longitudinal side of the bone, the long part of a bone, a crack, that's a fissure. A fracture that's, you know, perpendicular to the bone or right angle to the bone but doesn't go all the way through, green stick. Perpendicular fracture that goes all the way through but no fragments, transverse. Diagonal fracture, oblique. A fracture from excessive twisting, spiral. So those are the keys there. Okay, so there's 4 basic steps to healing a bone, right? So this is an example of healing a transverse fracture, a right angle fracture that goes all the way through. So we start off with the fresh fracture here. We have ruptured blood vessels forming this bloody little hematoma, right? This space. We get a bunch of internal bleeding in there. But the periosteum ideally holds or at least regrows around the bone and holds in this stuff. And as we supply it, our osteoblasts begin to produce spongy bone. So step 1, the bone fragging breaks. Step 2, we get spongy bone formation. So blood vessels start to reconnect, repair and reconnect blood vessels. Spongy bone comes in. And we get a fibrocartilage sort of plug. We form fibrocartilage around there to stabilize it while the bone is healing. Third step, bone fills in where the fibrocartilage was. So we get bone completely filling that in. The fourth step is where osteoclasts remove the excess bone. You can see in the third step, the bone fills in even the marrow cavity there. So osteoclasts are going to remove the excess bone in the marrow cavity, right? And osteoblasts are going to fill in the remaining holes in the bone. And we're going to end up with our original bone structure, compact bone. This is a long bone fracture here. So we've got compact bone filling that in on these outsides. We've got a nice marrow cavity lined with a bit of spongy bone. And the bone structure is where the fragment occurred is now thicker than original, so almost stronger. It's hard to get a fracture in the exact same spot twice. Okay, now we'll talk about what goes wrong with bones. So breaking, obviously, is what goes wrong with bones. Now let's talk about sprains. So a sprain is a pathology of the joint And it's basically where the joint moves too far and it stretches or tears ligaments. Remember, ligaments are nice, strong connective tissue that are bone to bone to stabilize bones, right? So ankle sprains are when your ankle rotates too far and it pulls on these ligaments, stabilizing it, stretches them out, and if it pulls far enough, it can even rip or tear those ligaments. So it'll stretch or tear the ligaments. If it's severe enough, if you tear enough ligaments, you can actually dislocate the joint where the bones are no longer properly jointed together. So sprains suck, especially since one sprain weakens all your ligaments, and it's sort of a sum thing. So the more sprains you have, the more you weaken those ligaments, the more you weaken that joint, the more likely you are to get sprains in that joint. So fractures are all about breaking bone. Sprains are all about stretching and tearing the ligaments that stabilize joints. Osteoporosis is bone degeneration. So in osteoporosis, you literally lose bone mass. So here's normal bone right here, and this is bone affected by osteoporosis. And you can see we've got big, wide open spaces where we've literally lost bone. So osteoporosis is where your bones are losing mass, losing density, and that increases your risk of fracture. So one of the biggest causes of osteoporosis is calcium debt when you're not old. So if you have a calcium debt in your body, you're not ingesting enough calcium. Remember, I said osteoclasts will break down bone to release calcium because you need it for muscle movement, right? So if you are not getting enough dietary calcium, you'll lose bone mass. As you age, osteoporosis tends to occur. It's much more, it occurs to a much stronger degree in women. Not entirely sure why, but as you get older, you're more prone to osteoporosis. And an extremely sedentary lifestyle can lead to osteoporosis. Sedentary means sitting around doing nothing. So, and diet, of course, sort of related to calcium debt. And one last one that might not be particularly obvious is that you could have pregnancy-related osteoporosis. This tends to be temporary, but at the same time, it's dangerous. So calcium is needed desperately for the growing fetus. You need a bunch of calcium as that fetus develops and produces bone. So that calcium is drawn from mom's blood supply. So mom can have a decrease of calcium and lead to osteoporosis. As I said, with age, women seem to suffer from menopause or women seem to suffer from osteoporosis to a greater degree than men as you get older. That's because menopause, for some reason, causes calcium to leach from the bones. We lose calcium from the bones during menopause. Not sure why, but there are medical treatments, a bunch of shots to try and stimulate more bone production in people suffering from osteoporosis, especially menopause-related osteoporosis. Okay, so we've hit fractures. We've hit sprains, osteoporosis. Next up is arthritis. There are actually two types two types of arthritis. So osteoarthritis is breakdown of the joints due to wear and tear. A lifetime of using your joints will lead to them sort of getting broken down. So arthritis is where you wear the joints. You may start to lose cartilage in the joint, and you'll get bone rubbing on bone, and that'll cause inflammation around the joint. And sometimes the bone repair can actually go wrong and reduce movement in the joint. And you can even, in advanced cases, get almost fusion of the joint. So arthritis is sucky. Osteoarthritis is from wear and tear, from a lifetime of joint damage and injury. So much more common in people with very active, dangerous jobs where they are, like footballers colliding into each other. We can contrast osteoarthritis, which is just a product of age and use and damage, with rheumatoid arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis is very different. It's an autoimmune disorder, which means your own immune system is attacking your joint. So if you look at a joint, at the structure, like here's your joint between the femur, the tibia, and the patella, right? And we have sort of this big membrane lining the whole joint. So it's the synovial, we have inside it fluid, synovial fluid, and we have sort of a lining around the whole thing containing that fluid, and it sort of protects the joint. So if this is the actual joint, right, we have a cartilage cap on either side, hyaline cartilage to smooth it out. And then it's actually got a lining of tissue around it, the joint lining. And inside that joint lining is a fluid to further reduce friction. In rheumatoid arthritis, your immune system attacks the lining of the joints. And this causes major inflammation of the joints, and it leads to cartilage and bone destruction. So, rheumatoid arthritis is much worse than osteoarthritis. Osteoarthritis we tend to see later in life. The only time you really see it in younger people is if they do something that causes excess wear on their joints. Rheumatoid arthritis can appear throughout someone's life. There's a heavy hereditary component to rheumatoid arthritis. So it is a disorder. It's not from wear and tear. Osteoarthritis, wear and tear. Rheumatoid, autoimmune disease. So, kind of blows. All right, that's halfway through. Now let's talk about the muscular system. Got some important vocab to learn for the muscular system. First up is the prefix myo. You'll never guess, based on the system we're in, what myo references when we use it as a prefix. Muscle cell, or muscle. Myocyte is a muscle cell. So anything that starts with myo is muscle. Muscle cells contract. Muscles contract. So the muscular system deals with tissues that can contract. If you'll recall, there are three basic types of muscles: the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, and the skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle lining hollow organs, cardiac muscle making up the muscle of the heart, and the skeletal muscle voluntary moving long bones. So smooth muscle, spindle-shaped fibers. We hit this in that 4 types of tissues lecture. Spindle-shaped fibers. Non-striated. We don't see the little stripes And remember, those stripes would allow a lot of contraction. Involuntary, not under your brain conscious control. You cannot think your intestines to contract more. And they line hollow organs, like the entire digestive tract, right? You have smooth muscle lining your esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, rectum. So, anything hollow has smooth muscle. You can take it a little bit deeper than you'd expect. Your blood vessels are hollow. Your blood vessels are lined with smooth muscle. So, anything hollow has smooth muscle around it. Any organ system that's hollow has smooth muscle lining it. This causes the smooth muscle contraction produces peristalsis. Think of it like a wave, right? So the smooth muscle can contract kind of like closing a ring. And so if I swallow something into my esophagus, and you think of the gulp, right? What happens is above the object, a ring, it contracts and pushes, and below it relaxes and opens. And so we get this wave of muscle contraction pushing things through my esophagus. Your stomach has those contraction waves going back and forth to mash up your food. Your intestines also experience peristalsis to produce that wave to push food through the intestines, through the large intestine, out through the rectum. Smooth muscle. So, this is peristalsis in the esophagus. Just a wave of contraction moving along the hollow organ, pushing something through it. Cardiac muscle. Where's the cardiac muscle? Yeah, heart. Cardiac, heart. Okay, so again, involuntary, not under your control. Striated. We see those bands or stripes. Bands or stripes mean that this muscle can contract a lot. The more bands there are, the more it can contract. So if you think of your muscle relaxed like this and contracted like that, right? The more bands you are, the more contracted you can get. On either side of those bands is essentially a little the either side of those bands essentially flanks a contraction unit, contractile unit. Anyway, so wherever you see bands, you know that between them it can contract. That's striations, telling you that there's heavy amounts of contraction that occur. Cardiac muscle is also highly branched. So we get branched out structures. This is contrasted with skeletal muscle, which doesn't show these branched structures. And finally, we have the presence of intercalated discs between muscle fibers, muscle cells. So remember, muscle fiber is the same as muscle cell. So intercalated discs are between muscle fibers, and basically they just allow the muscle fibers to share the same cytoplasm, and that allows signals in the cell cytoplasm to travel between cells easily and quickly, because your heart needs to move those signals along fast in order to contract at its regular interval. Finally, we have skeletal muscle. This is under voluntary control. It is striated. We have those nice, beautiful bands. It is attached to the skeleton. Skeletal muscle generally attaches two different bones. So we talk about an origin and an insertion. If you want to think about how that works, how it moves bones, origin is basically attached to the bone that stays still. So my bicep is attached sort of to the humerus and a little bit in the shoulder. And when I contract the bicep, that part stays still. It's not moving. It inserts onto the ulna and allows you to pull that ulna. So origin is where it's anchored. Insertion is where it's essentially pulling and moving a bone. So muscles attached to the skeleton because it allows you to move your bones. Again, I said a muscle fiber is an individual muscle cell. We can see in skeletal muscle, we don't have those branched muscle fibers like we see in cardiac muscle. So we have these long, long fibers, right? If you take a bunch of muscle fibers and bundle them together, you get a muscle fascicle. If you take a bunch of muscle fascicles and bundle them together, you get a muscle. So, muscle fiber, individual muscle cell, can be very long. Bundle of muscle fibers, muscle fascicle. So, if each one of my fingers is a muscle fiber, there's a little membrane around it, and this is a muscle fascicle. Multiple fibers, bundle of fibers. Multiple fascicles make up what you think of as the actual muscle, like a bicep. So let's talk about how we move our bones. One, muscles attach to the bone via tendons. Remember, tendons are strong connective tissue, and they are fibrous connective tissue. They connect a muscle to a bone. So both where the muscle originates, there's a tendon attached to the bone that attaches to the muscle. And then where the muscle inserts, there's another tendon. The muscle attaches to the tendon, and then the tendon attaches to the bone. So when the muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendons and moves the joint. So the tendons don't stretch. So when the muscle contracts with those tendons not really stretching at all, the bone moves. If the tendons could stretch, if they were really elastic, then the muscle contraction wouldn't do anything. But because the tendons are not elastic, they're strong, fibrous connective tissue attached to the bone. When the muscle contracts, it's the bone that moves. Contraction pulls on the tendons pull on the bone, and the bone moves. Multiple muscles act together. Very rarely in the body do you have one muscle being the only thing that moves that joint. So when we talk about moving a joint, we're generally talking about multiple muscles acting together to move a joint. So if I'm referencing moving my, forearm, flexing my arm and flexing my radius and ulna there, flexing my elbow joint. That is the proper terminology. I can talk about the bicep. If I'm talking about the bicep, then I call the bicep the prime mover. Prime mover is basically the muscle you're talking about. So it's the muscle that you're talking about that's contracting. So here's my bicep contracting. It inserts on the ulna right about here. So, boom, bicep contracts. Moves my forearm. Starts to flex the elbow joint. Now, it's not the only muscle in there that moves that. There's actually multiple muscles. For instance, there's a muscle called the brachialis that inserts somewhere along here and inserts farther down. And so it's the contraction of the bicep and the brachialis that produce that strong elbow flexion there. So that's those two muscles working together. Since I'm talking about the bicep is the prime mover. The brachialis is an agonist, helping to move that joint. If I were talking about the brachialis would be the prime mover, and the bicep would be an agonist. So it's all sort of point of view there with which muscle you're referring to. The prime mover is the muscle you're talking about, and, you know, its contraction, and the agonists are muscles that help that contraction. Antagonists are muscles with the opposite action, right? So if you think we have bicep and brachialis here causing flexion, what muscle is along here? That's right, the tricep. The tricep, if you contract the tricep, if you feel this muscle sort of pinch in there and feel it contract, you can feel it contracts when we extend our elbow joint. Extend the joint, the tricep contracts. So the tricep is an antagonist to the bicep. It has the opposite action. Bicep flexes the elbow joint. Tricep extends the elbow joint. So, with most of your muscles, well, at least with a lot of muscles in your body, you can just put your hand on there and feel the contraction. And so you can sort of know what the movement that muscle causes based on the contraction of the muscle. So, pretty cool stuff. Like your pecs right here, when they contract, they give you the bird flappy motion. Whee! So that's the pecs. They contract and they flex your arms like this. So you have a pectoralis major, which is what you think of when you say pectoral muscle. And then you have a pectoralis minor, which is an agonist to the pectoralis major. So, all right, so there we go. Bicep, right there, biceps brachii, triceps brachii. Brachii, by the way, arm. So, not too terrible, I think. Okay, so here's, boom, contraction and relaxation. And we can see when the bicep contracts, the tricep relaxes. When the tricep contracts, the bicep relaxes. Contraction is the muscle getting shorter. Relaxation is the muscle getting longer. There we go. Bicep contracts, tricep relaxes. Tricep gets shorter and fatter, contracts, bicep relaxes. It's just sort of a little cycle. Okay, so let's look at muscle fiber anatomy, the muscle cell. So myofiber is literally a muscle cell. Call it a fiber because an individual muscle cell is a very long cell made up of multiple contractile units. Contractile units, think about those stripes, those bands you're seeing. Okay. The myofibril of a myofiber is the striated parts. Woo! So, when we look at a single myofiber, a single muscle cell, there are multiple myofibrils making up little contracting units, giving you those multiple striations. So, single myofiber, big long fiber, big long cell with lots of myofibrils in it, lots of contractile units. Within the myofibril, we find the myofilaments. Myofilaments are proteins for muscle contraction. So they are arranged with each other kind of like this. So if we have the bands on either side right here, then we have our myofilaments facing each other like that. And when muscle contraction occurs, the filaments slide. And so this is a relaxed muscle. And then as it gets shorter, we get that sliding. And the sliding is literally why that cell can become shorter. So the myofilaments are little proteins. And it's actually those myofilaments themselves that allow you to see the striations. So, boom. Here's a big old muscle. Here's a fascicle. And then here's an individual muscle cell, a myofiber. And then here's a zoom in on one part of a muscle cell showing the myofibril. Multiple myofibrils in a myofiber. And then inside a myofibril, we can see the myofilaments. All right. Two basic types of myofilaments. We have large and small. And the myofilaments allow contraction. So they allow the muscle to get shorter. So my fingers here are the small myofilaments. And so when they contract, they're going to sort of move alongside each other like that. The thin protein is, my fingers there. And then we have a thick protein. The thick protein, if we look at it, has all these neat little, what we call heads. You can think of them almost like little suction cups or fingers. So if this is the thick protein and my finger is one little thin protein, then that thick one is going to push it. So they actually like grip on and pull it around. And so pulling it allows it to move. That was not the best demonstration with my hands. Luckily, I have pictures. Okay, so, woo! Lots of vocab in this one. I am very sorry, but that's the way the news goes. Okay, so sarcomere. The sarcomere is one contracting unit. Muscle contraction occurs because of all the different sarcomeres in a muscle fiber and all the sarcomeres in the multiple muscle fibers together and all those fascicles together. All those sarcomeres contracting allow a muscle to contract. You want it to only contract a little? Not all the sarcomeres go. You want to contract it the maximum amount? All the sarcomeres contract. Right? So, sarcomeres contract. They're the contracting unit. It is one full set of thin proteins, thin filaments, and the thick filament. There are, as I said, lots and lots of sarcomeres in a single muscle fiber. And how much that muscle fiber can contract is based on the number of sarcomeres. In other words, contraction is the sum of sarcomere action. The amount a muscle fiber can contract is based on the amount of sarcomeres that will contract. More sarcomeres means more contraction. And different numbers of sarcomeres can contract in a single muscle fiber, right? Because, right, I have fewer sarcomeres contracting here than here, right? So you get sort of graded amounts of contraction, and that means different amounts of sarcomeres are contracting. Hopefully, is making sense. So let's break down So yeah, when many fibers contract, you get the contraction of the whole muscle. So let me show you how a sarcomere works. So this is the sarcomere. We have the thick filament sort of running in between thin filaments. So the thick filament pulls thin filaments together like this. It's actually really cool. So sarcomere, thick filament, pulls the thin filaments along, right? And they slide over each other, and the sarcomere contracts. So, boom. How does this whole thing happen? It's based on something called sliding filament theory. So in sliding filament theory, the thick filaments cause the thin the thick filaments cause the thin filaments to slide towards the center, right? So here are the thin filaments, thick filaments pull them along, and they slide. So, the thick filament has these little bitty heads, kind of like come hither fingers, that bind to the thin filament, right? And then they go, come hither, and they pull it towards the center. So, thick filament has little heads on it. Come hither. They bind to a thin filament, and they pull it towards the center. And they can do that multiple times. Heave, 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 until you get maximum contraction. So I'll get that little heave, 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 like that. That's actually called the power stroke. Power stroke. Wow, yeah. So the head binds. We pull it towards the center with the power stroke. The head releases, and we just do the whole thing again. This requires ATP. That's literally muscle contraction. So I have this cool video. Here's one of those little heads. Do not pretend you need to know cross bridge, but this is a thin filament in yellow. This is the little head coming up, and it binds up, right? There's some ATP action going on. And then power stroke. Come hither. Right? Then it releases. Returns to its original spot, and it's ready to go again. There's some narration there giving you very complicated anatomy and physiology, muscle chemistry that we really don't need to know. So, but now it's ready to just attach, pull again. Attach, pull again. Attach, power stroke, release. Attach, power stroke, release. And so it basically just crawls the thin filaments together. You know, like attach, heave, attach, heave, attach, heave, attach, heave, ha, ha, contraction. Okay, boom. That is how a muscle cell contracts. Oof, this is heady stuff. Hopefully you are taking breaks here and there. Like, you know, you don't want to try and watch all the way through because they're sort of like separate things. If you're going to rewatch this, you know, a lot of the bone stuff you can sort of watch through, but anytime you get a basic subject change, right? So when I talk about muscles and prime movers, agonists and antagonists, great. Pause, take a break. Then muscle cell anatomy, great. Pause, take a break. Then muscle cell contraction, pause, drink whiskey, cry, take a break. Next up is motor neurons. Motor neurons are basically how we control muscle contraction. Remember, this is under voluntary control, which means your brain is in control, your conscious brain. The involuntary stuff is often controlled or at least influenced by your brain as well. But here, our conscious brain is in control, which means there are connections from the brain to the muscle. It goes brain, spinal cord, it's all central nervous system, out to the peripheral nervous system, where the muscle nerve, where the motor nerve comes in and connects to the muscle, right? So a motor neuron is a nerve that connects to muscle fibers. So when you want to contract your muscle, a signal or an impulse travels from your brain to your central nervous system to the motor neuron. Impulse travels down the motor neuron, and then the impulse is transferred to the muscle. There's actually, where the motor neuron connects up to the muscle, there's actually a tiny little space called the synapse. That's the little space between where the motor neuron and the muscle connects. Actually, synapse is any space between where neurons connect. So here, this is the synapse between the motor neuron and the muscle, right? So in order to take the impulse from the neuron and send it into the muscle, we actually release a neurotransmitter. Boom. It's called ACH. If you really want to be an overachiever, you can remember acetylcholine, ACETOCHOLINE, acetylcholine. Basically what happens is the impulse comes to the bottom. And here in the synapse, we release acetylcholine across the little synapse. The acetylcholine binds to the muscle, and then the muscle generates an impulse that travels along the membrane of the muscle fibers. And the impulse traveling along the muscle fiber causes contraction. As long as there is ACH, as long as there's acetylcholine attached to the muscle stays contracted. There's actually a little enzyme that rolls in here and removes acetylcholine. And it's when you remove acetylcholine that the muscle relaxes. So when I contract my muscle right here, it stays contracted, there's acetylcholine. And when I say, it's time to relax, there's a bunch of enzymes removing acetylcholine and get it fully relaxed. So, kind of cool. The motor neuron sends an impulse down. At the end of the motor neuron, we release the transmitter, ACH. ACH binds to the muscle cell. Muscle cell sends the impulse down, and that causes contraction. When it's time to relax, you have to remove the ACH. The ACH is just going to stay there until the enzyme kicks it out. It's actually called acetylcholinesterase, but seriously, you don't have to try and remember that. That's the enzyme that kicks it out. Okay. Now that we've talked about how a motor neuron works, let's talk about the fact that a motor neuron will control multiple muscle fibers. It is Very rarely, if ever, where you have one neuron per one muscle fiber, one muscle cell. Instead, you have multiple neurons, and you have one neuron controlling multiple muscle cells. Motor neuron and all the fibers that single motor neuron controls is called a motor unit. Motor unit, one motor neuron attached to all the muscle fibers that it's attached to. So right here in this beautiful little picture, we can see one motor neuron, and it's attached to a bunch of different muscle cells, a bunch of different myofibers. So when you have few neurons, very few motor neurons, connected to a large amount of muscle fibers, then they all tend to contract at the same time. Think of your lower back, the big old lower back muscle. If you contract it, it's sort of hard to, slightly contract it. When you contract it, if you can even feel the muscle, it all just sort of contracts at the same time. That's because you don't have a lot of neurons, but those neurons are connected to a large number of muscle fibers. So, boom. More neurons equals more precision. So the muscles that control your eyes are very close to the one neuron, one fiber level. And so you have a lot of precise control over where you're looking, right? You can slowly sweep your eyes around, moving them ever so slightly. Fingers. You have a lot of precision in how much pressure you put on an object when gripping it. That's because you have more neurons in the motor unit. More neurons in the motor unit, more precision. Or, no, wait. That was a terrible way to describe it. More motor units in the muscle, more precision. Yeah, let me go back a second. Because, remember, a motor unit is the neuron and all the fibers it controls. Right? That's a motor unit. So, if you have a muscle, right, and you have 10 fibers in it, and you have one unit controlling all 10, then the signal comes in and says contract, and all 10 contract. But if you have one neuron controlling 2 fibers, right, then you can contract 2 fibers at a time and get lesser amounts of contraction, right? With that one neuron, 10 fibers contract, boom, whole thing contracts. One neuron, 2 fibers. So, one neuron and 2 fibers is a motor unit. The more motor units you have in a muscle, the more precise that muscle is. Hopefully that made sense. We're getting close to done. So let's do some just selected muscles. Here is the bicep, right? It's so named because it has 2 origin points. It originates in 2 separate spots. By 2, sep head. So, bicep. It pulls the forearm, flexes the elbow joint. The tricep has 3 heads. So, the green, red, and yellow are all different colors for the one tricep, illustrating here's one origin, here's the other origin, and here's the third origin. 1, 2, 3 tricep heads. And they insert over here in the elbow joint, and they contract and extend the forearm. They extend the elbow joint. Here's a cool arm and shoulder muscle. This one's over in the forearm and wrist there. It's called the supinator. So it flips the wrist, right? So if you look at all these pictures I put in here, people are standing like this, or like a, hey, get my hands down here. It's called anatomical position, whatever. Anyway, the supinator is responsible for doing this. You are not moving your upper arm at all, right? I can twist my whole arm at the shoulder joint. That is not the supinator. The supinator is when my elbow is held still and I flip over my wrist. Supinator flips the wrist. And amazingly enough, that action is called supination. So the supinator supinates. Flips the wrist without the elbow moving. Then there's your delts. Your deltoids attach up along your clavicle, your collarbone, and also along your scapula, your shoulder blade. And they insert onto the humerus. So, origin, insertion. Remember, insertion is the muscle, or is the bone that's getting pulled around. So they're going to move the humerus. And it will cause the entire arm to move forward or backward. So sort of like when you're walking. So that's some deltoid action there. And it also allows abduction, which is this. So, whoa, flapping your arms like an idiot. Yay, okay. So, this is actually, flexing your entire arm. You're flexing the whole humerus here. And here you're extending the humerus. So, flexion, extension. Flexion, extension. And then here, abduction. Remember, when you abduct someone, you take them away. So you are abducting your arm away. Abduction. So, deltoid is all about moving your humerus around. Then you have the little muscles in your rotator cuff. There's actually a whole bunch of them. So, if you look, you do not have to remember supraspinatus, subscapularis, and infraspinatus. But they all attach to your scapula. So, they originate on your scapula, right? So, and then they attach to your humerus. And they, rotator cuff, right? They rotate your arm in there. So they rotate the upper arm in the socket. So a bunch of rotatey stuff. Let's see, that does not look... Okay, so... And the key here to know that you're moving your rotator cuff is to watch your elbow. So... Right? If I'm feeling my humerus, and I rotate my humerus in the socket there, I feel, there's no way to move your elbow without rotating like that. I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about rotating your elbow requires rotating the humerus. So, when you rotate the humerus, you rotate the whole arm. Whereas if you do your supinator, right, my elbow staying still. Okay, so rotator cuff, all about rotating the humerus. All right, let's talk about some awesome chest muscles. The pectoralis major, your pecs, right? Boom. So, the pecs, move your arms towards and away from the chest. So when your pecs contract, boom, your arms come to the front. Then when they relax, they go back. So, again, contract, relax. So, they also allow you, so when they move their arms towards and away from the chest, you can think of this in two different ways, right? So I like to think of it as like clapping like a seal. Because if I say flap your wings like a bird, people would do this, you know. Even though when birds actually flap their wings, they're doing this. So I say clap like a seal because, you know, too many Saturday morning cartoons have shown people do this. So pecs allow this. Wow. The rectus abdominis, your abs, your abdominals, right? They allow you to essentially do crunches. So, flexion of the abdominals alone moves your body slightly, a little bit. So, it basically, that's pretty much it. That's really, any more than that, and you're getting other muscles in on the action. So, your abs, your rectus abdominis, do not do a whole lot more than slightly flex your rib cage in relation to your pelvis. Next up, the back. Erector spinae. So the erector spinae holds your spine straight or erect. Erects your spine. So, this is extension of the spine. Holds you standing straight. Sort of the antagonist to the rectus abdominis. Huh? Agonism, antagonism, bringing that up again. A callback to a previous part of the lecture. That's how a good lecturer does it. Then we have the trapezius. Trapezius is so named because it's sort of shaped like a trapezoid, right? When you take both sides into account. So the trapezius originates all along the spine, and it does a lot of stuff. So it connects up to your clavicle, and it helps move your shoulder blade around. It also helps move your head. If you are flexing your trapezius, you sort of do this. What? I wonder. It's your moving your head up and to the side, like that. That's some trapezius action. Your trapezius is this big old shoulder, or this big old neck muscle right here, right? So when you think of trapezius, think of this. What you're really asking for when you ask for a shoulder rub is a trapezius rub. So, boom, trapezius. There's one on the left and the right side, so when you take them together, it forms this funky-looking trapezoid, hence trapezius. So it helps move your shoulder blade around, right? Oh, hey, how's it going? Check this out. I'm moving my shoulder blade. And it helps you look up and to the side. Rotate like this. Here's my rotation and flexion. Rotate and flex. And then moving my clavicle around. Not clavicle, I just said, I meant scapula. Moving my scapula. And so I can feel when I'm moving it around my scapula, right? I can put my hand on my back and feel in about here, not on the scapula, because there are individual muscles in there that you don't want to. But right between your scapula and your spine, you should be able to feel your trapezius flexing a bit there. So, helps move your shoulder blade, your scapula, and helps you look up and to the side to look smart and contemplative. And of course, it helps you shrug. So that's elevation. That's actually literally the anatomical term for that movement. Elevate. And you can do neck flexion alone without skull rotation. So that, God, Night at the Roxbury, that's a reference no one's going to get, but essentially just head side to side like oh my God. That's all trapezius action. So, lots of stuff with the trapezius. Right? Shrugging. Look up and to the side. And neck flexion. Okay. Boom. Onto the leg. And after the leg, we'll just talk about breathing. So, we have the gluteus maximus, which is your butt. Your butt muscle is gigantic. I think by mass, it's the largest muscle in the human body. So it originates basically on your butt crack there, and it inserts down along the femur. So it comes around all the way down. And it helps you move your leg back. So when you are walking, it's not the forward, it's not the forward part, it's the back part. That's some glute action. So, leg extension is moving the leg back into the standing position. Leg rotation, right? Just sort of rotating your leg. So, when your kneecap moves, I have no idea if that's visible. When your kneecap is moving, that's leg rotation. That's some butt stuff. So, telling my students about butt stuff. And it helps stabilize your knee, even. Your butt is extremely important. Your gluteus maximus. Next up is the quadriceps group. Quadriceps are on the front of your femur. This whole muscle group is the quadriceps. There's actually a group of muscles in there, but I'm not going to make you learn each and every one. But it helps with leg extension, pulling your leg back, and it helps with knee extension. You know, kick. Then, in contrast, we have the hamstring group, which is on the back of the femur. So, right here. When the hamstrings contract, your leg pitches forward like you're kicking a soccer ball with your whole leg, not with just your knee. So there's like a knee snap where you kick like that, and then there's the kick with your whole leg. And it's your hamstring that lets your whole leg swing. And then it's also involved in knee flexion. So if the quadriceps do the snap, then the hamstring brings it back. And then we have our big old gastrocnemius. Gastrocnemius is your calf. Gastrocnemius. Gastrocnemius. So close to done. Okay, so the gastrocnemius helps flex the knee, just like with the hamstring, and it also moves the foot around a touch. So, I have pictures all to the side here. Here's the gastrocnemius, and you can see that it inserts on the back side of the femur here, or it originates on the back side of the femur here, and it inserts on the heel. So if you feel your gastroc contracting, you'll feel it both when you move your leg at the knee and also when you move your foot, like toes up towards the sky and toes down towards the earth. That's when you'll feel some gastrocnemius action. So, finally we come to breathing. And this is all about the diaphragm, or as I like to say, the diaphragm. So if you have your rib cage here, where you have the bottom of the rib cage, you have a diaphragm. Yeah, I'm a dick to you, aren't I? Oh, go on. You have the diaphragm. The diaphragm sort of actually separates your lungs and your heart from your guts. Anyway, it does something kind of funky. When the diaphragm contracts, it pulls down into your guts. Contracting pushes the diaphragm down. Relaxing pushes the diaphragm up. So it separates the chest cavity out, right? So we have thoracic and abdominal, and it's the diaphragm that separates them. Contraction flattens it, pushes it down. Relaxation pushes it up. So when it pulls down, it stretches your lungs. When your lungs stretch out, air rushes in. That's inhaling. It's really hard to try and find your diaphragm to feel it contract. So I recommend just, you feel it when you breathe. So when you inhale, your diaphragm is contracting and flattening out. And that's pulling your lungs down, stretching them down, allowing them to pull in air. And when it relaxes, it pushes up and pushes your lungs into a smaller shape and pushes the air out, exhaling. Okay, so you might want to go back through this and take some time on every selected muscles slide to listen to it again, to try and get it. And don't be afraid to touch your muscles and feel them contracting. So, touch yourself. All right, great. Inappropriate joke deleted. So, that's the lecture.